everybody. We trust that your understanding of how the Bible fits together as a complete whole is growing as we see the connections between the Old and New Testaments. As we move forward, we will see how humanity is hopelessly stuck in a world of sin and violence. However, we will also see that despite the influence of evil, God does not give up on His creation. Hopefully, this section gives you a better understanding of some of the parts of Genesis we often skip over, like the genealogies. After the lesson, we'll be back to discuss what this has to do with us today.
Have you ever noticed how young children often go fearlessly into dangerous situations? They walk into the middle of the street without a care in the world. They pick up sharp knives without caution. And sometimes they even go right up to strangers, take their hands, and start to walk off with them, completely oblivious to the violence other people can pose. But of course, adults know that the world is full of all kinds of trouble. Natural disasters destroy life and property. Diseases bring suffering. Machines can harm us. And we know that perhaps the greatest dangers of all are those posed by other people. Men and women commit violent acts of assault, murder, and war on their fellow human beings. If we are aware of human history, or if we're just paying attention to current events, it's nearly impossible to deny that human beings have filled this world with violence. We have entitled this lesson, A World of Violence, and we're going to look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8, where Moses described the troubles and violence that took place in the world shortly after humanity's fall into sin. In these chapters, Moses described how human beings began to fill the world with violence and how God reacted to those troubles. We will examine three aspects of this portion of Genesis. First, we will look at the literary structure of this material. Second, we will focus on the original meaning of these chapters. And third, we will explore how the New Testament teaches us to apply these passages in our own day. Let's look first at the literary structure of Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8. These chapters in Genesis touch on a number of different topics and include both narratives and genealogies. Now, these complexities often leave us with the impression that these chapters don't fit together very well. But when we examine this portion of Genesis more closely, we'll see that it is a carefully crafted literary work with a unified purpose. As we look at Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 8, we will see that this portion of Genesis divides into two main sections. The first section consists of chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 32, and we have entitled it Early Violence and Hope. The second section consists of chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, and we have called it Later Violence and Hope. The early scenario of violence and hope of deliverance in Genesis chapters 4 and 5 divides into four parts, and these parts form two parallel sets of narratives and genealogies. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 16 form a narrative which parallels a second narrative in chapter 4, verses 25 through 26. And chapter 4, verses 17 through 24 form a genealogy which corresponds to a second genealogy in chapter 5, verses 1 through 32. We will examine these materials by exploring some of the relationships between the corresponding narratives, and then we'll give attention to the parallels between the two genealogies. In the first place, Moses began by writing a story about sinful Cain in chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. This passage is the well-known record of the time when Cain broke into a fit of jealous rage and murdered his brother Abel. When we look more closely at this passage, it becomes apparent that it divides into 5 dramatic steps. The story begins with Cain and Abel living together harmoniously in verses 1 through 2a. Even so, when we turn to the end of the narrative in verse 16, we find a different circumstance. Cain is alone, banished from the good land, from his family, and from God's special presence. The second step of the story, found in verses 2b through 7, touches on the events that led Cain to murder Abel, specifically the distinction between the sacrifices each offered to God. Put simply, God was pleased with Abel's sacrifice, but he rejected Cain's sacrifice. God also warned Cain about the power of sin seeking to master him, but Cain paid no attention. The third section of this narrative, verse 8, forms the turning point of this story. In this section, Cain murdered his brother Abel. Cain and Abel went away from the place of sacrifice into a field, and there, just as God had warned, sin mastered Cain and turned him into the first murderer in human history. The fourth section of this narrative appears in verses 9 through 15 and describes the curse and protection God gave to Cain. God placed a curse on Cain by banishing him to wander far from the land of Eden, but he also protected him from being attacked by other people. So we see that Genesis chapters 4 through 5 begin with the story of Cain's terrible sin. He was so corrupted by sin that he actually murdered his righteous brother Abel. And as a result, he was destined to live far from the place of God's blessing. Now that we have seen the structure of the opening narrative of Genesis 4 through 5, we should turn to the second narrative which appears in these chapters, the corresponding account in chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. This passage turns attention away from sinful Cain to Adam's third son, righteous Seth. The report of righteous Seth divides into three short steps. First, in chapter 4, verse 25, Eve gives birth to Seth. The second step in this report appears in 4:26a, where Moses noted that Seth also had a son, Enosh. Nothing much is made of this event, but Moses followed his report of Enosh's birth with a third step in 4:26b, where he added a telling comment on the spiritual character of this family. In 4:26b, Moses wrote these words, "At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord." Put simply, Seth and Enosh were men who called out to God in prayer. In contrast with sinful Cain, these men were righteous before God, and they demonstrated this righteousness through faithful worship and prayer. With the basic contrast of these parallel narratives in mind, we should now turn to the parallel genealogies in chapters 4 and 5. The genealogies of Genesis 4 and 5 often seem to be little more than obscure records of biological descent, and for this reason, many interpreters overlook their importance. Yet a closer look at the genealogies reveals that they contain vital information that served Moses' purposes in writing this portion of his primeval history. On the one hand, the first genealogy records Cain's sinful lineage in chapter 4, verses 17 through 24. In these verses, Moses listed a number of Cain's descendants and reflected on how sin had turned this family into a proud, boastful, and threatening clan. The second genealogy consists of Seth's righteous lineage in chapter 5, verses 1 through 32. In this passage, Moses recorded a number of important names in Seth's family, yet in contrast with the line of Cain, this family continued to be righteous and faithful. One of the ways we can see this intention is to notice the way Moses included two names in both lists. Both Cain's genealogy and the lineage of Seth contain the names Enoch and Lamech, and Moses explicitly contrasted these men with each other. Consider first what Moses said about the two men named Enoch. On the one side, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, we read these words about Cain's descendant Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. Cain and his son Enoch exalted themselves in great pride by naming the city after Enoch. We can see the significance of this comment when we notice what Moses wrote about the Enoch of Seth's line. In chapter 5, verse 24, Moses commented on Seth's Enoch in this way: Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. It would be hard to imagine a more striking contrast between two men than we find here between the sinful Enoch and the righteous Enoch. In addition to the contrast set up between the two men named Enoch, Moses also mentioned a Lamech in Cain's line and a Lamech in Seth's line. Once again, strong contrasts stand out between these two men. On the one hand, Cain's Lamech was a horrible figure. Genesis chapter 4 verses 23 through 24 report that Lamech was a murderer and took great pride in his murderous exploits. By contrast, to display the character of Seth's Lamech, Moses recorded Lamech's words at the birth of his son in chapter 5 verse 29. Lamech named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." As was the custom in biblical times, Seth's Lamech named his son as a prayer to God, expressing the hope that his son Noah would bring deliverance from the terrible condition of life which began when God cursed the ground in the days of Adam and Eve. Now that we have noticed how Genesis chapters 4 and 5 convey a pattern of early violence and hope of deliverance, we should turn to the second scenario of violence and hope as it appears in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. When we look more closely at these verses, it becomes apparent that chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 divide into three steps. First, verses 1 through 3 concern characters known as the sons of God. Second, verses 4 through 7 focus on other characters known as the Nephilim. Following these two steps, Moses added an afterword in verse 8, mentioning Noah once again, the man in whom there was hope of deliverance. The two main steps of these verses describe a series of threatening events that took place on earth and then reveal how God reacted to these events. Let's look first at the threat of the sons of God and at God's reaction in chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. Unfortunately, these verses are among the most difficult to interpret in the book of Genesis. The difficulty primarily centers on verse 2, where we read these words. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Moses did not explain precisely who these sons of God and daughters of men were. Apparently, he expected his original readers to understand what he meant. But it has been impossible for modern readers to settle the identities of these characters beyond question. In the history of interpretation, three reasonable identifications have been suggested. First, the sons of God may be Sethites who married women descended from Cain. This interpretation has some merit because of the contrast set up between the Cainites and Sethites in chapters 4 and 5 of Genesis. A second option is that the sons of God may be angels, and the daughters of men were mere humans. This view also has some merit because angels are often called sons of God in the Old Testament, in passages like Job chapter 1 verse 6 and Psalm 29 verse 1. A third option is to understand the sons of God as kings or noblemen who took peasant women. This outlook has merit as well because in the ancient Near East, kings were often called sons of God, just as the son of David is called God's son in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14 and in Psalm 2 verse 7. Although I favor this third interpretation, we should not be dogmatic about any particular position. Now, even though we cannot be sure who these characters were, we can be more certain of what they did. You will recall that in Genesis chapter 6 verse 2, we read that the sons of God married any of the daughters of men they chose. This is not ordinary language in the Old Testament for legitimate marriage, and it strongly suggests that neither the women nor their families consented to these relationships. Rather, the sons of God, who may have been powerful noblemen, forcefully took women without their consent. The language here may even mean that the sons of God actually raped these women at will. In all events, the violence exemplified earlier in the exploits of Cain and his descendants reached another area of life, the violation of women. After Moses described the threat of the sons of God, he turned to his main concern, God's reaction to these events. We read these words in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. God grew tired of the ways sin continued to bring violence to the human race and declared that he would not tolerate this corruption forever. Nevertheless, God graciously determined to allow humanity another 120 years before executing his judgment. A second set of actions on earth and divine reaction appears in Genesis chapter 6, verses 4 through 7, the account of the Nephilim. In verse 4, we first read about another threatening circumstance that developed. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, some older Bibles simply follow the Septuagint and translate the Hebrew word Nephilim as giants. But this translation is unfortunate because it does not convey the connotations of the word. Scholarly opinion is divided over the precise meaning of the term, but it is most likely that it refers to strong warriors or warlords. In this passage, Moses specifically described these Nephilim as heroes of old, men of renown. The term heroes, or ha-giborim in Hebrew, denotes warriors or powerful soldiers. In this context, the military notoriety of the Nephilim should be taken negatively. These men were known for their exploitative warfare and violence as they inflicted terror on those around them. The violence that began when Cain killed his brother Abel and continued in Cain's descendant Lamech had now reached even greater proportions as the Nephilim soldiers threatened violence at every turn. As we read in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. With the appearance of the Nephilim, the corruption of the human race had grown to such proportions that sin utterly dominated humanity. And as a result, we read in verses 6 through 7 that the Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. God saw how the Nephilim terrorized his world and determined that it was time to intervene with massive worldwide destruction. Happily, Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 do not end with words of judgment. Instead, in keeping with the overarching patterns of this portion of his primeval history, Moses added an afterword of hope in verse 8. There we read that even though God determined to destroy humanity because of the corruption of sin, there was one man who provided hope. Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. In these few words, Moses completed the scenario of threat and hope of deliverance. The destruction of violent, sinful humanity through the flood would actually result in a deliverance for future generations. From our explorations of the literary structures of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8, we see that these chapters in Genesis focus on two major issues. First, they focus on the threat of violence from those who rebelled against God in the days of Cain and his descendants. Second, they focus on the threat of sinful people in the days of the sons of God and the Nephilim. In both cases, however, Moses indicated that God would bring deliverance through the one special son of Seth, the man named Noah. Now that we have seen the basic structure and central concerns of this portion of Genesis, we are in a position to ask a second question. What was the original meaning of these chapters? What was Moses communicating to the Israelites as he led them from Egypt to the Promised Land?
Hopefully, this information gave you a better understanding of Genesis and how God is working in the world. Let's take some time now to discuss some of these themes with your group. Our first question is this: how are violence and hope related for the Christian today? Please pause the video to discuss. Our second question is this: what role does family play in the life of the believer? Please pause to discuss. We hope this lesson provides just a glimpse of God's grace in an unfaithful world, and trust your understanding of His grace grows in your study.